What the then smartphone adds to it is a few different kinds of other, well, applications that were also familiar to us, like calculation. Like, okay, it's a calculator as well as a phone. Well, that's kind of cool. It's a camera as well as a phone. So you can kind of think of the cell phone as taking all of these other familiar technologies that had already successfully spread, in large part because they pushed these first three buttons. They answered yes to two or more of those as good technologies to spread well, and we bundled them up into one device. Well, that's really great. Hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and former university professor. Thanks for joining me in another video in my series on tech prudence, or how we can be wise about what technology we invite into our lives, into our children's lives, into our societies and communities. Lots of technologies are very good for us. Lots of technologies do really good work in accomplishing things, solving problems, addressing challenges in the world around us, and sometimes can even make us better people, or at least help us become better versions of ourselves. But as we know, not all technologies are all positive, and sometimes it takes a little time to figure out whether they are net positive or net negative. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm a big fan of using good empirical sciences to try to evaluate the impact of certain kinds of technologies in our lives. But one of the challenges is certain technologies can spread so widely and become so deeply rooted in our lives before we get a chance to sort of discover what their long-term positive or negative consequences are, that then if it does turn out to be negative, it's really hard to undo them. It's hard to remove them from our lives. They're a little bit like, I've used the metaphor of kudzu. It's this vine that spreads broadly, deeply, grows really fast. It's really hard to eradicate once it's in our lives. And there are technologies that might have those features. Once we find out that they're a problem, it's too late. So then it behooves us, I think, to try to anticipate which technologies, which new technologies stand the likelihood of having that kind of aggressive growth and deep rooting into our lives that would make us concerned if they turn out to be negative. So just having those features isn't necessarily negative, but it should make us cautious, because it may be hard to do anything about them if they turn out to be negative. It may be hard to put the genie back in the bottle, or whichever metaphor you like. So I've proposed, drawing upon the cognitive science of culture, that there are 4 questions we can ask of a new technology that at least will give us hints. They're sort of heuristic questions to help us figure out, are these likely to be wide-spreading and deep-rooting sorts of technologies? 4 questions. The first one is it relatively easy to use? Particularly easy to use because it pushes the right buttons in our minds. It takes advantage of our natural psychology. Our natural cognition is sometimes the jargon that we have by virtue of being a human living in an ordinary human environment. Okay, so is it easy in that respect? Second, does it tap those basic human motivations that pretty much we all share anywhere across lots of different kinds of situations? So these really basic human emotions, human motivations, human values, human priorities that characterize the kind of animal we are living, again, in the kinds of environments we do. That's the second question. Third, are these technologies attention demanding in some interesting way? And I suggested there are 2 ways they can be attention demanding. They can take our natural propensities and tweak them just a little bit to make them a little bit interesting and surprising, or they can sort of hype up the kinds of things that our minds, our motivations are attracted to, a little bit like the way that animation does with faces and human figures. It makes them into what's called super stimuli, so that they really demand our attention very quickly and easily. And then my 4th question is it piggybacking on another technology or another cultural form that already has become a super spreader, is all over the place, and is going nowhere fast? I described those in some depth in the previous video, so I won't return back to those in great depth. If you are interested in what's sort of the psychology behind what makes us human that's going to make things very attractive to us, what are those little buttons to push in human psychology, I cover a lot of this in my book, Thriving with Stone Age Minds, where I talk about some of this basic psychology that characterizes just the human animal. One of the features of our human animalness is that we are hypersocial. I go into a fair amount of length in this book about our hypersociality, and I want to focus on that one in this video because it's that hypersociality that leads to the technology that I want to talk about, and that is smartphones. Humans are immensely social. We live in very large groups. Group living has served us very well. But to live in large groups, we need to do a lot of things. We need to form relationships with each other. We need to trust each other. We need to keep track of what each other are doing. We need to keep track of who's cheating whom. We need to figure out who are the people I can count on and trust. We have to solve all kinds of cooperative problems to live in the big groups that we live in. And unlike other kinds of animals, we live in really big groups that we're not terribly related to. And we individuate. We pay attention to particular individuals in the group to do things like cooperate in solving problems, creating tools, sharing information, and doing lots of things. Our particular variety of sociality is really unusual among animals. And it is facilitated, of course, by us talking. We're good at talking. In fact, we are a super loud animal. I mean, when we think of loud animals, we might think of howler monkeys or songbirds that just, like those Carolina wrens that just seem to have an outsized voice or something like that. But I'm sure animals around the world look at humans and go, man, those things are noisy. They're constantly chattering. They're constantly talking. And yeah, we are. That's part of who we are too. We're language users and we communicate with each other. That helps us build these tight-knit kinds of cooperative communities, even when we're not related to each other. Then it becomes no surprise at all that once we move into these larger, more mobile societies because of technologies like harnessing certain kinds of animals, like oxen and horses especially, that help us move from place to place more rapidly, and then, of course, really accelerating that with the invention of steamboats and trains, and then eventually automobiles and so forth, suddenly the people we care about might not be right next to us anymore. And while there may have always been a little bit of a need to be able to communicate with people at great distance, that need gets amped up as the people we care about, the people that are our kind of community, become scattered around. And now we want to be able to communicate with each other at great distance. And so there's this sort of social need that's changed by certain kinds of technologies that sets the stage for the invention of the telephone. And so in the 19th century, we get lots of people starting to experiment with telephone kind of technology. I don't think it's an accident that this is corresponding also to these other new transportation technologies that are leading to these kinds of pressures. First, to be able to communicate at great distance, at speed. The telephone gets invented, and it ticks many of these boxes. We can see in retrospect now that telephone was a winning kind of technology. Why? Well, relatively easy to use. I pick it up, I talk into it. That's the basics of it once I'm attached to the person on the other end. Well, that's how we normally communicate with people anyway, is we listen and we talk. So that part's pretty straightforward once you figure out, all right, what's the right mechanism for dialing and connecting? Easy to use because it's taking advantage of ordinary human psychology. Second, we're motivated. Like I said, we're hypersocial. We want to communicate with each other. And this fills that need really nicely. Thank you very much. So it's ticking a couple of the boxes. Is it attention demanding? Well, sure it is. I can talk to somebody at great distance. That's intuitive that I can talk to people. That I can talk to people at a distance is actually largely part of our human psychology experience. I can shout and somebody can hear me at a distance. And sometimes I can talk to people that I can't even see right now. That part is largely intuitive. That's part of our ordinary human experience. What makes the telephone kind of interesting is the length of the distance. It's surprising in that regard. And that I don't have to talk loudly for my voice to go a long way. Well, that's kind of cool. So there's something a little bit attention demanding already with the telephone because it takes our ordinary kind of thinking and takes it someplace different, someplace novel, someplace surprising. Okay, so it's ticking a lot of the boxes for a technology that is likely to spread successfully, all else being equal. Well, then what about the cell phone? Well, it goes to The fourth criteria that I introduced in the last video is I said, even if you can't answer those first three questions, is it easy to use? Is it tapping basic human motivations? And is it attention demanding in some interesting way? If you piggyback on a technology that does those three things, you might be a winner as well. And that's what the smartphone manages to do. The smartphone takes a familiar technology that had already spread broadly, the landline telephone, and, well, removes the line. But otherwise, at least initially, the regular cell phone is doing something cool. But what the then smartphone adds to it is a few different kinds of other, applications that were also familiar to us, like calculation. Like, okay, it's a calculator as well as a phone. Well, that's kind of cool. It's a camera as well as a phone. So you can kind of think of the cell phone as taking all of these other familiar technologies that had already successfully spread, in large part because they pushed these first three buttons. They answered yes to two or more of those as good technologies to spread well. And we bundled them up into one device. Well, that's really great. And then they're also piggybacking on these easy touch interfaces that the wizards in the computing world decided, well, through their experimentation with human interfaces, that humans are really good at this kind of stuff. We're pretty good at touch. We can learn that very quickly. In that sense, the cell phone, the smart cell phone especially, is just piggybacking on these other familiar technologies. But really importantly, it remains very easy to use. It remains addressing sort of basic human communication needs and desires. That's one of the things that makes it exciting. Had the communication part, the phone part, not been there, had it been just a calculating camera, for instance, that maybe also put you on the internet, I'll bet would not have been nearly so successful and managed to become a global thing. That communication piece is so fundamental to human psychology. That makes it a really easy one to go because it's part of our natural motivational systems. We desire that kind of communication. We want to talk to each other, to connect, yes, but also to get gossip and other kinds of strategic information about each other. So the wireless phone, eventually evolving into the smartphone, really had all of the features of a successful technology for spreading very widely and sort of sticking its roots deeply into us. And so it's very hard to imagine that it will be eliminated very easily. It could only be replaced by something that does similar kinds of stuff even better. So I hope this illustration, this example, has helped you see more about how those four questions help us identify technology. In the next episode, I will then turn our attention to social media, another fast-spreading kind of technology, and try to give an analysis of why that has been so successful and why it is so hard to undo. But that's it for now. Until next time, try to stay tech prudent, and thanks for joining me.